They say you never truly escape your past, no matter how many borders you cross or names you change. Even now, sitting alone in a cramped Arizona apartment, far from the violence of Cuernavaca, I can feel it like the taste of metal at the back of my tongue, the sharp edge of memory never dulled by time. I live in a world of routine: wake before sunrise, pack boxes in a refrigerated warehouse, drink cheap coffee, and return to 4 silent walls. But some nights, the quiet hum of the air conditioner is drowned out by echoes from another life, a life I was never supposed to survive. The story they tell about Arturo Beltrán Leyva is the kind you see splashed across news headlines and whispered in the Narco corridors, ruthless, flamboyant, a king with a crown of blood and gold. They call him the Mastermind, the final word in terror and authority, the man who ruled an empire with his bare hands. But that's the first and greatest lie. I know, because I was there in the halls where shadows weighed more than bullets, where a glance could kill and silence was more valuable than gold. My name, for whatever it's worth, is Javier Rojas. But most who remember me, if anyone does, knew me as El Silencioso. I was never a sicario, never one of the trigger pullers. My weapon was observation, my shield invisibility. I did not climb the ladder of power with blood, but with secrets. I became useful not because I was loyal to a man, but because I could blend into the scenery, the wallpaper, in a room where every secret was a loaded gun. People assume the heart of power in the cartel beat in the roar of armored convoys, in the staccato of gunfire, in the public rage of men like Arturo. But power, real power, was quiet. It moved in the space between words, in the lingering silence after a decision was made. I felt it long before I understood it, a chill presence that needed no threat to command obedience. It lived not in the gold-plated rifles or gaudy celebrations, but in a single room in a mansion on a hill, surrounded by the scent of bougainvillea and the faint, constant odor of fear. It was there, during a storm of rage that sent even the most hardened sicarios scurrying for cover, that I saw the truth with my own eyes. Arturo, the beast of legend, the so-called king, stood at the threshold of his private study, fists clenched and veins throbbing with fury. I was waiting in the hallway, clutching a folder of reports, my body tense with the instinct to survive. I expected an eruption, a volcanic blast that would send tremors through the house. Instead, as Arturo entered the room and the door drifted half open, I watched his entire posture shift. Shoulders slumped, his voice, a thunder moments before, became a low, nervous murmur. And sitting behind a desk, not with gossip magazines, but with maps and ledgers, was Isabela Ifuentes, his wife. He asked her, barely above a whisper, "Do you think it's the right move, mi amor?" There was no bravado in his tone, no hint of command, just a subordinate awaiting instructions from the true architect of the empire. In that moment, the illusion shattered. The king was nothing more than the noisiest pawn on a board controlled by invisible hands. I have lived in the shadow of that secret ever since. And if you're listening to this, it's because the myth needs to die. You think you know who the real boss is. You're wrong. Let me tell you what I saw, because in the world I come from, seeing the truth can be a death sentence. I was born in Guerrero, in a village most people only know as a dot on a map, a place where hope was a rumor passed around like an old photograph, faded, fragile, easy to lose. My father was a grocer, proud of his calloused hands and the tiny store he built stone by stone over 30 years. My mother ran the house with quiet strength, stitching together meals from little and raising my sister and me with a fierce kind of tenderness. We were never rich, but there was dignity in the daily struggle, a sense of belonging even in poverty. That dignity didn't survive the arrival of the Beltrán Leyva men. They came not as conquerors, but as creditors, squeezing our town dry with protection fees that doubled each month. At first we tried to reason, then to hide. Both strategies failed. I watched my father lose sleep, then his savings, then finally the spark in his eyes. I'll never forget the day 2 men in crisp shirts and snakeskin boots stood at our door demanding payment my father didn't have. Their smiles were polite, their words gentle, but the threat behind them was as cold as steel. That night, I saw my mother weep for the first time, her face turned to the wall so we wouldn't see her shame. We lost everything in slow motion. First, the store shelves emptied, customers afraid to be seen with us. Then, the last of our livestock disappeared, a payment in kind. Friends stopped visiting. The house filled with silence and hunger. I tried to help, odd jobs, borrowed pesos, but the debt was too deep and the noose kept tightening. My father stopped speaking, moving like a ghost through rooms that echoed with memories of better days. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, a daily humiliation that pressed in from every direction. I wasn't drawn to the cartel by greed or fascination with violence. There was no romance to it. It was despair, plain, sharp-edged, and absolute. I saw my parents breaking beneath a weight they didn't deserve. I heard my little sister whisper her prayers at night, asking for mercy from gods who didn't listen. The world of honest work and fair rules had abandoned us. Only one system remained, and it was built on fear. In that world, survival was a currency, and my family's only chance depended on what I was willing to do. I spent nights wandering the outskirts of town, rehearsing impossible choices. Sometimes I fantasized about running away, but the debts would follow. Other times I imagined fighting back, but I knew how quickly rebels disappeared in Guerrero. The only path left was to surrender, to offer myself as tribute, not as a fighter, but as someone who could be useful. I remembered the way I'd always watched from the edges, the skill I had for noticing what others missed, for keeping quiet, for becoming invisible. The decision crystallized on a morning so ordinary it should have meant nothing. My father sat at the table, staring into a chipped mug, his hands shaking as he tried to write another plea for mercy. My mother's eyes were red, but her voice was empty. I couldn't watch them be destroyed piece by piece. If the monster was going to devour my family, maybe I could crawl into its belly and learn to survive. That afternoon, I found my way to the house of an operator whose name everyone in town whispered, but no one dared to say aloud. I knocked on the door with hands that trembled, introduced myself as the son of no one important, and offered the only thing I had left my capacity to see and hear without being seen or heard. I didn't ask for money, for power, for revenge. I asked for a chance to make myself useful enough that the cartel might spare my family. The operator looked me over, his eyes as hard as river stones, then nodded once. "We don't need more gunmen," he said, "but maybe you'll be good for something else." In that moment, I stepped across an invisible line, leaving behind whatever innocence I had. I was no longer a son, a brother, a boy from Guerrero. I was an asset waiting to be shaped. The first days are a blur of new rules and old fears. I was not welcomed, not truly, more like tolerated, an unknown variable to be measured and watched. They called me the quiet one from the beginning, partly as a joke, partly as a warning. My job was simple, or so it seemed: observe, remember, and never draw attention. The real test, I would come to learn, was not surviving violence, but surviving silence. The man who brought me in was named Don Lucio, a mid-level operator with a reputation for never raising his voice, only his eyebrow. His house, hidden behind tall iron gates and a wall of jasmine, felt more like an office than a home. I sat across from him at a worn wooden table as he explained what he expected from me. "We have enough men who think with their fists," he said, sliding a cheap spiral notebook toward me. "I need someone who notices, who comes and goes, who listens before he speaks. You do that, and you might live to see your family again. My first assignment was as unglamorous as it was vital. Keep track of who visited which houses, who lingered in the cantinas too long, which faces appeared at the Sunday market without warning. Most people in the organization dismissed these tasks as busy work for newcomers, but Don Lucio watched my reports with a cold kind of curiosity. "Don't embellish," he warned me. "Just the facts. Lies get people killed, even quiet lies." It was my first lesson in the cartel's logic. Information was power, and mistakes were fatal. At first, I clung to the edges of every room, eyes down, ears open. The men around me swaggered, boasting about jobs and scores I could barely understand. The true violence of the cartel, the casual talk of torture and executions, turned my stomach, but I forced myself to listen, to record, to never react. I learned quickly that showing fear was more dangerous than showing disrespect. If you couldn't hide your nerves, you'd never be trusted with real secrets. It was during one of those endless afternoons, a heat wave suffocating the city, the air thick with the scent of sweat and fried meat, that I witnessed my first real display of power. A rival courier had been caught skimming product. The punishment was public and swift, a warning painted in blood for anyone thinking of betrayal. I watched from the back of the room as the man was dragged in his pleas, ignored his fate, sealed before a word was spoken. The men laughed, some turned away in boredom, but Don Lucio watched me, not the spectacle. When it was over, he said, "That's what happens to those who think they're invisible. Make sure you're invisible in the right way." Fear became my companion, but so did a strange exhilaration. I found that I could blend in, that people forgot I was there if I didn't speak, didn't move, just listened. I wrote every detail in my notebook each night: who had a new car, who was late, who glanced at the wrong woman. The rhythm of criminal life became a strange kind of comfort. I told myself it was for my family. I told myself I was still outside the real violence. But with every assignment completed, every risk, survived, the boundary between who I was and who they wanted me to be grew thinner. It wasn't long before I was summoned to a gathering at a mansion on the outskirts of Cuernavaca, a gathering where the rules would change. I remember the moment as if it were carved into my memory, stepping into a room heavy with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive liquor, my heart pounding, my mind racing with every possible way I could fail. But all Don Lucio said was, "Sit, watch, learn." And so I did. In that house among men who ruled with fear and gold, I took my first real step into the world that would consume me. It was the beginning of an education I never asked for, but one I would come to master far too well. There is no ceremony for men like me, no oath spoken over candles or saints. In the Beltrán Leyva world, loyalty is tested in shadows, not sanctified in public. My initiation was neither a blessing nor a baptism. It was a trial by silence, a test of whether I could endure the weight of secrets and the chill of complicity without faltering. After weeks of quietly gathering intelligence, I was summoned again, this time not to Don Lucio's modest home, but to the main residence, the fortress perched on a hill overlooking Cuernavaca. The journey there felt like a slow approach to execution. 2 men drove me in an armored SUV, their faces hidden behind sunglasses, their words few and clipped. I sat in the back, hands folded over the notebook that had become my passport and my prison. Inside, the house pulsed with an unnatural calm. Everything was immaculate marble floors, shining under crystal chandeliers, guards stationed at every door, their eyes flat and unreadable. In the dining room, a dozen men sat at a long table, lieutenants, accountants, enforcers, each with their own orbit of fear and respect. At the head, in a tailored suit and with the indifference of a man bored by power, sat Arturo himself. I kept my gaze low, feeling the scrutiny of 100 unspoken judgments. Don Lucio spoke for me. This is the one I told you about. He listens, he learns. He doesn't ask questions. Arturo barely looked up. He simply gestured for me to approach, and I handed him my reports. Neat, unembellished, the facts distilled to their coldest essence. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice gravelly with boredom and cocaine. I swallowed my answer, rehearsed 1,000 times to be useful, senor. For my family to be safe. The room was silent long enough for my pulse to drown out all other sound. Arturo nodded, waved me away, and that was that. No blood, no threats. Just an acknowledgement, and my trial had begun. The real initiation happened later that night. I was ordered to stay to observe how business is done. What followed was a lesson in the price of silence. A young courier had gone missing along with a shipment of precursors. The investigation was swift, the punishment swifter. In the courtyard beneath the indifferent gaze of stone angels, I watched as the accused was beaten and questioned, his cries muffled by the night air. I was told to record every detail: who spoke, who flinched, who turned away. The message was clear. Information wasn't just power, it was protection. But it was also a curse. When it was over, Don Lucio found me outside, shaking in the dark. "You think this is the worst it gets?" he asked almost kindly. "It's not. The only way you survive is by understanding what to forget." He pressed a new notebook into my hand. "Write what matters. Burn the rest." That night, as I sat alone in a room meant for servants, I realized that initiation was not about proving strength. It was about proving invisibility. My trial was not to stand out, but to disappear, to be the set of eyes no one noticed, the memory that could be erased at a moment's notice. From then on, my world became narrower, quieter, rules sharper, and more unforgiving. I learned the unwritten code. Speak only when asked. Trust no one. Above all, never let them see your fear. The cartel did not need my loyalty. It needed my silence. Every day, every task was another test, one I would keep passing, even as the cost grew heavier with every secret I was forced to carry. You learn quickly that violence is only the visible part of the machine. My work was not to pull the trigger, but to oil the gears to keep the machine running with observations, not bullets. Still, violence was always there, humming just below the surface, a threat and a promise. My early assignments were simple in theory, brutal in implication. I was tasked with documenting every deviation from routine: who lingered at the gate, who made calls at odd hours, which soldiers spent too much or drank too hard. It was a kind of accounting, but every mistake had mortal consequences. Don Lucio warned me, loyalty in this place is worth nothing unless it's proven every day. One wrong word can end a bloodline. At first, I made mistakes. I wrote too much, worried over every detail, second-guessed myself into sleepless nights. I'd pass my notes to Don Lucio, watching his eyes for approval, his mouth for the twitch that meant I had gone too far or not far enough. The pressure to be exact, to be invisible but indispensable, was suffocating. I thought of my family constantly. Every new scar of anxiety was another wall between me and the boy I had been. The first time my information was used to eliminate someone, it was surreal. I had noted a man's strange disappearances from meetings, his sudden spending spree. Days later, his body was found in a ditch outside of town, throat cut so cleanly that the autopsy report called it surgical. I told myself it was just coincidence, that I wasn't responsible. But the next time, when another man vanished after I noted his debts and divided loyalties, I could not hide from the truth. My words had become weapons. Fear became routine. I learned to ignore the screams in the courtyard at night, to tune out the whispered threats in the hallways. My world was reduced to lines in a notebook, and the ritual of burning pages I could not risk anyone else seeing. Yet as the weeks passed, a numbness set in, a thickening of the skin that I once thought belonged only to monsters. I told myself I was different, that I was saving my family, that I was not really part of the bloodshed. But I was. Each page, each observation was another brick in the wall between me and the life I had lost. My access grew. I was trusted to sit in on meetings I barely understood, to document not just men, but movements, shipments, payoffs, routes that snaked from the Pacific coast to the heart of the capital. I saw how information could destroy a man more efficiently than any bullet. I watched as men who had seemed untouchable one week became ghosts the next. Gradually, I stopped trembling. The nerves that once left my hands shaking at night dulled into a kind of clinical focus. I learned the value of silence, the necessity of forgetting the way danger could hide in a single raised eyebrow. I began to see the world, as Don Lucio did, a series of risks of assets and liabilities of patterns that could save or condemn. I became valuable. Men who once ignored me now watched me with the wary respect reserved for priests or executioners. They did not fear my strength. They feared what I knew and what I might say. It was power of a sort. It was also a sentence. As I climbed further into the organization's trust, I told myself this was as far as I would go. I was not like them. I was only here to survive. But the machine had other plans, and I was already deeper than I could admit even to myself. It's strange how power can creep up on you soft as dusk, until one day you wake up and realize you're standing at the center of the storm. I was still invisible to most, just the quiet man with the notebook and the watchful eyes. But in a world built on secrets, invisibility was the surest way to climb. And as my reputation for accuracy and discretion spread, doors began to open, doors I would have been wise to avoid. It was Isabella who first saw what the others missed. She was everything the narco wives in the corridors pretended to be: beautiful, untouchable, a presence both refined and remote. But she was also something no song ever captured: a strategist, a mind cold and surgical, the eye of the hurricane that circled the entire organization. While Arturo raged in public, she ruled in private, shaping the future of the empire from behind closed doors. I remember the moment it changed. I'd been called to deliver a weekly intelligence report. Instead of the usual audience with Don Lucio or a minor lieutenant, I was escorted upstairs to the study, the very heart of the mansion. Isabella sat behind a desk cluttered not with jewelry or gossip magazines, but with maps, coded ledgers, and dossiers thicker than a priest's Bible. She didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her gaze was as direct as a blade. She asked questions no one else had ever asked, not just who or when, but why. Why did this man leave early? Why was this route suddenly unreliable? Why were there rumors of unrest in the port city? She wanted patterns, not just data. Her mind moved 3-4 steps ahead of everyone else. I answered carefully, measuring each word, aware that the smallest slip might be my undoing. For reasons I still cannot fully explain, she began to rely on me. I became her unofficial eyes and ears, a ghost inside the system, trusted to bring her problems before they turned into crises. Sometimes, she would send me to deliver information directly to Arturo, knowing full well he would believe the insight was my own. She used my silence as a conduit, feeding directives through me that shaped the empire without ever exposing her hand. The more she trusted me, the deeper I went. I began to see the organization not as a pyramid, but as a system of orbits. Arturo, the visible sun, hot and unstable, and Isabella, the hidden center of gravity. She resolved problems with leverage, not violence. A compromised official here, a threatened family member there, a debt paid at just the right moment. When violence was necessary, it was swift and surgical, never theatrical. Isabella's power was in her restraint, her ability to manipulate outcomes while letting others take the fall. With that trust came new responsibilities. I was tasked with monitoring high-level meetings, keeping a ledger of which lieutenants could be pressured and which ones might soon become liabilities. I watched as fortunes rose and fell on the strength of a single whispered rumor. I documented the slow corrosion of trust that spread every time a body was found in a ditch, the terror that loyalty meant nothing and everyone was replaceable. I saw what happened to those who failed, not because they were weak, but because they were no longer useful. I understood finally that survival meant more than following orders. It meant anticipating danger before it arrived and knowing when to disappear. I became indispensable not through loyalty, but through utility. But even as my access grew, so did my fear. I knew too much, and in Isabella's world, that was both a blessing and a curse. The higher I rose, the clearer it became. The cartel was not ruled by the loudest man, but by the quietest woman. And she was watching me more closely than anyone else. Inside the cartel was a world within worlds, layered, suffocating, dazzling, and brutal all at once. On the surface, we lived in opulence, white tablecloth dinners, champagne that never seemed to run dry, parties where politicians, celebrities, and traffickers mingled beneath crystal chandeliers. Laughter echoed through the courtyards at night. Music pulsed from hidden speakers, and the air was perfumed with money and danger. It was a theater of power, staged for outsiders and insiders alike. But beneath that glittering veneer, there was a different reality, a life governed by unwritten rules and ancient fears. Silence was the first law. Speak only when spoken to, and never about the things that mattered most. Betrayal, even by omission, was punished swiftly. Trust was a currency no one could afford to spend. Every relationship, every look, every whispered joke was laced with suspicion. I moved through this world as both witness and participant. I saw the toll that constant vigilance took on even the most hardened men. Paranoia flourished in the cracks of luxury, lieutenants slept with pistols under their pillows, wives swapped coded rumors in the powder rooms, and children learned early how to tell when a car was following them. The threat of violence was everywhere, but so too was the threat of sudden exile, the fate reserved for those who became passive, a word used with equal parts pity and contempt. Passivity was the slow death, the fading away of those who had outlived their usefulness. The most dangerous currency was information. Isabella wielded it like a scalpel, slicing away at potential threats before they could become real. Sometimes I would see her in the garden after midnight, speaking quietly to a visiting banker or a local mayor, always in places where no microphones could reach. These meetings were never recorded, never acknowledged. But the effects were felt within days, a raid averted, an official silenced a competitor's fortune, evaporating overnight. Loyalty, too, was transactional. Men swore fealty to Arturo's face, but behind closed doors, their loyalties shifted with the winds of fortune. The few who truly believed in something, family honor, some tattered sense of justice, were either broken or forced to bend. I lost friends to these tides. Men who had shielded me in my early days now vanished, driven into hiding, or buried in unmarked graves. Each loss was a reminder that in this place, you survived by adapting, by becoming colder, by learning to let go before you were forced to let go. Yet there was camaraderie of a sort, a brotherhood built on mutual fear. I shared drinks with men whose stories could have filled libraries of blood and regret. We laughed, told lies, played cards deep into the night. Sometimes, in rare moments of weakness, someone would speak of home, of mothers, and lost sons, of dreams that survived just beneath the surface. These confessions, always whispered, never lingered long. By sunrise, masks were back in place, and any trace of softness was erased. My own relationship with Isabella deepened, but never with comfort. She entrusted me with secrets, used me as her conduit to the inner workings of the organization, but I never mistook it for friendship. I was her instrument, her asset, a tool she kept sharp and close, but always at arm's length. Sometimes I wondered if she saw anything of herself in me, or if I was simply another thread in her web to be cut if I ever stopped serving her purpose. Living in that world demanded constant performance. The greatest fear was not death, but irrelevance. The only certainty was that sooner or later everyone would be tested, and almost everyone would fail. I told myself I could survive by staying silent, by doing what I was told, by never wanting more. But in a place where information was power, and power was life, I was already entangled in currents far stronger than my will. It took me years to see the organization for what it truly was, not a pyramid with Arturo at the top, but a solar system with two suns, one seen and one always in shadow. Arturo, with his rage and spectacle, was the center of attention, the actor everyone watched, the threat everyone feared. But Isabella was the gravitational force holding everything together. Architect designing futures, while her husband lived only for the next battle. My role in this system evolved without me realizing. Isabella began using me not just as a messenger or observer, but as a collector of leverage. Find out what makes them bend, she would say, and I would, tracking not just enemies, but allies, addictions, debts, affairs, ambitions. I became fluent in the language of compromise, learning how a quiet word or a single photograph could move more money, more drugs, more power than any gun. The most startling lesson came during the Morales affair. The organization had been threatened by a prosecutor too stubborn for his own good. Arturo's answer was violence: kidnap the man, destroy his family, leave a message for the world. Isabella's answer was different. She found the prosecutor's wife, uncovered her secret debts, and used that weakness to neutralize him without ever raising her voice or firing a bullet. She explained the plan to me in the study, her voice calm as she outlined each step. Violence, she said, is for the desperate and the stupid. We are neither. It was the first time I truly understood the scale of her reach. She didn't just command sicarios or bribe politicians. She controlled a web of lawyers, bankers, judges, many of whom never realized whose game they were playing. Her methods were surgical: resolve problems before they exploded, keep the army quiet with rewards, cut out cancer before it could spread. And all the while, let Arturo play the part of the beast, absorbing every headline, every bullet meant for the real brain behind the throne. My own usefulness became my cage. I watched Isabella manipulate the fates of men who imagined themselves untouchable. She orchestrated alliances with government officials, brokered deals with rival cartels, even laundered money through companies so legitimate that their owners never questioned the source of their fortune. I was the vessel for her instructions, the silent hand that delivered her will to the outer rings of the organization. One night, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Arturo, increasingly paranoid, ranted about betrayal in the ranks, his voice echoing down the marble hallway. Isabella listened without emotion, then dismissed him with a wave. After he stormed off, she turned to me. "He's become a liability," she said. "Too noisy, too unpredictable. The investors are getting nervous." The words hung in the air, colder than any threat I had ever heard. It was a verdict not of passion, but of business. That was the twist I never saw coming. All my life I thought survival meant proving myself, climbing higher, becoming indispensable. But to Isabella, every asset was expendable, every pawn replaceable. Even the king could be removed if he threatened the board. I realized then that my greatest strength, my silence, my usefulness, was also the very thing that would guarantee my end when the time came. From that moment, I lived in a constant state of unease. Every meeting felt like a test, every conversation a possible prelude to exile or execution. Isabella's confidence in me was both my shield and my death sentence. I had become her tool for controlling the inner currents of the empire, but I was never anything more than a tool. The true conspiracy was not that a woman ran the cartel, but that everyone, including me, had played their roles so well for so long that no one dared question who was really moving the pieces. I understood too late that I was as trapped as any of the men I had helped destroy. There are no heroes in a system built on secrets, only survivors, and even survival is never guaranteed. The fall of an empire is never sudden. It is a sickness spreading quietly, hollowing out the bones before the body ever stumbles. By the end of 2009, paranoia had poisoned everything inside the Beltrán Leyva organization. The laughter at our parties grew brittle, meetings filled with tense silences. Arturo, once the boisterous king, became a haunted man, jumping at shadows, seeing betrayal in every corner. Cocaine fueled his suspicions, but it was fear that truly devoured him. The day Mateo disappeared was the day I stopped believing anyone was safe. Mateo had been with the organization longer than most meticulous loyal, the kind of man who believed in doing the job right, not in the spectacle of violence. His only mistake was a 12-hour delay on a shipment. A mechanical failure any other year would have warranted nothing but a reprimand. But this year, nothing was forgiven. Arturo called an emergency meeting, his eyes bloodshot, his hands shaking. I sat in the corner, notebook in hand, heart pounding as Mateo tried to explain. There was no reasoning with madness. The verdict was sealed before he even spoke. Guards dragged him away. No one said a word. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. I left the meeting shaken, a cold sweat crawling down my spine. That night, I found Isabella in her study. I didn't speak of my fear, only reported the facts our best logistics chief executed for a flat tire. She listened, impassive, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Arturo is a risk to the business," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He's too noisy. Investors are worried." She didn't say it was over for him, but I heard the finality in her tone. If she could discard her own husband, what did that mean for me? Everything moved faster after that. Arturo's inner circle collapsed into suspicion and panic. Friends turned on each other. Old alliances shattered overnight. Men I'd known for years disappeared without warning. Each day, I wondered if I'd be next. The line between asset and liability blurred until every conversation felt like a trial, every silence an accusation. It was in this chaos that I realized my time was running out. I had spent years collecting secrets, but secrets are only valuable until someone decides they are too dangerous. My usefulness was wearing thin. If I stayed, I would die. If I ran, I might survive a little longer, but only if I could disappear completely. I began to plan my escape with the same caution I'd used to survive all these years. I siphoned small amounts of money from side channels, hiding cash in a battered suitcase beneath the floorboards of a safe house. I reached out to an old acquaintance, a coyote who specialized not in moving drugs, but in erasing lives and inventing new ones. Every step was a risk. Every phone call, every meeting was another chance to be caught. I slept little, ate less, and trusted no one. Then came the day the news broke: Arturo Beltrán Leyva. The great Barbas, gunned down by the Marines in a luxury apartment complex. The king was dead, and the purge began. Isabella moved swiftly, quietly erasing anyone who knew too much, anyone who had seen the way the organization truly worked. I knew I was on that list. I had maybe a day before her men found me. On my final night in Mexico, I became the ghost I'd always pretended to be. I slipped out through back alleys disguised as a laborer, carrying nothing but a change of clothes, a few $1,000s, and a forged passport. The journey north was brutal buses, safe houses, desert nights, spent listening for footsteps that never came. Each mile was another layer of my old life stripped away, another friend, another memory lost to necessity. When I finally crossed the border, every muscle in my body ached with relief and fear. I wasn't free. I was just somewhere new, waiting for the past to catch up. Crossing the border felt less like escape and more like stepping into a different kind of prison. In Arizona, I became Ricardo Mendez, a nobody with rough hands and a fabricated history. My days were measured in shifts at a vegetable packing warehouse, my nights in restless sleep and the illusion of safety. For a while, the routine became a balm. I convinced myself that distance was protection, that Isabella had larger problems to solve than an old intelligence asset living in obscurity. But the past, I learned, is never content to be left behind. I lived in constant vigilance, waiting for a car to idle too long outside my apartment, for a stranger to knock at the door with a familiar look in his eyes. Still, as months turned into years, the paranoia faded to a dull ache. I saved what little I could called home with carefully coded messages, tried to believe that I had been granted a second life. Then, one afternoon, a quiet knock shattered the spell. The man who entered was immaculate suit, pressed shoes, shining hair, carefully combed, utterly out of place among the desert dust and poverty. He spoke with the calm assurance of someone who had never once feared for his life. "Señor Rojas," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He smiled, almost kindly. "The lady sends her regards. She hopes you've enjoyed your vacation." There was no threat, no need for one. Everything I feared was true. My disappearance had never fooled her. My escape had been an intermission, nothing more. He handed me a heavy envelope inside a new passport plane, tickets to Zurich, and instructions as clear as they were final. "The business has changed," he explained. "It's gone global. It requires minds like yours." I understood then that freedom for someone like me was a fiction, a reward granted only long enough to remind you what you're missing. I flew to Europe the next day, not as a fugitive, but as a promoted ghost. Isabella's reach extended farther than I'd ever imagined. She did not need to threaten me because I already belonged to her. My talents, my silence, my history, they were all assets to be redeployed, never released. This is my confession, my warning, and my epitaph. I was never a king, never a hero, never even truly alive inside the machinery of power. I was a shadow kept alive by other shadows, useful only as long as I could disappear and reappear at her command. I learned that the true rulers of our world are not the loudest, not the ones whose names fill headlines or whose deaths spark headlines. The real bosses are those you never see, the ones who trade bullets for secrets, fear for dependency, violence for leverage. If you listen to this and think you understand how power works, think again. The world is built on stories like mine, lives bought and sold by those who never need to show their faces. Arturo was the noise, the mask, the spectacle. Isabella was the architect, the CEO, the queen who moved pawns and kings alike. And in the end, I am only what she allowed me to be, a ghost, bound forever to a secret that can never truly die. So beware the myth of the cartel king. The real boss is the one you never see coming, the one who makes sure you never escape, not even in your dreams.